Hello everyone, my name is Sonia Romano from the Water Post EU, and I'm here today joined by Dr. Eoin Drea, Senior Research Officer at the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. Eoin specializes in EU geopolitics, political economy, transatlantic relations, and the pressures facing Europe's middle class. Eoin, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Europe enters this spring with familiar economic pressures and another layer of instability coming from the Middle East. Energy supplies are disrupted, trade routes are under pressure, and the defense commitments are rising. You've said that Europe's economic strength is key to its ability to act strategically. Can Europe sustain all these priorities, defense, Ukraine, competitiveness, without first reforming its economic model first?
Sonia, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here. The short answer to your question is no. Europe is very ill-prepared to meet this moment. And at the very core of that, I believe, is an outdated and inflexible economic model. And I always say to people here in Brussels and all over the EU, the problem isn't that Europe is lacking money or that we don't have the resources. The problem is that we allocate the money. It's an allocation problem. And the money is allocated in all the wrong areas. So really what I would say is that, before we can be taken seriously as a global power, we really need to look internally at the economic reforms we need to implement before we can start talking about a geopolitical Europe.
And zooming in a little bit on the energy sector, because this is a sector that has a lot of pressure right now. Energy security has long been Europe's Achilles heels. LNG flows are disrupted, oil prices are volatile, and dependence on external suppliers feel riskier than ever. Does this crisis finally force Europe to think and act more geopolitically on energy, and how urgent is diversification right now?
I would say energy diversification and moving towards completing the single market in energy it should be one of the top 3 priorities for the European Union. We need to diversify our supply, but we also need to integrate as a bloc within the EU. And this, everybody knows what we need to do. It goes back to Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, 2015. We had the Juncker Energy Union plan, more interconnections, more investment in the grid to allow more renewables to come on stream. And it's absolutely a top priority because it's probably the number 1 priority for large industrial companies in Europe, the price of energy. So anything we can do to lower the energy price will be good for European industry and ultimately good for the European economy and European consumers.
Switching from Europe a little bit and pivoting to the transatlantic partnership, of course, the United States remain deeply involved in the region. The transatlantic partnership remains essential, but the balance of initiatives seems to be shifting. Do you see EU-US relations stabilizing, or are we more moving towards something that is transactional and competitive?
Yes, I think we've actually reached the transactional and competitive stage already. And I think, what the actions of the last year from Washington have shown is that Europe can no longer forecast with certainty what US actions will be. You don't have to be best friends to have a very successful trading partnership, but what you do need is some sort of certainty as to what conditions will look like in 6 months or 12 months ahead, particularly for business. And unfortunately, from what I hear from European businesses and European politicians, Europeans are not getting that from the administration in Washington at the moment. So I think Europe is in a very difficult situation where it will seek to try and stabilize the relationship with the US while simultaneously seeking to diversify our trading relationships with India, with Australia, with Mercosur, the economies of South America. And I think that will be the strategy for the EU in the medium term at least.
Right. And you mentioned trade, which used to be a very technical terms, but now it's getting very geopolitical and political especially. Public trust in trade agreements is fragile and political consensus is harder to sustain, what should Europe prioritize in its trade strategy today if it still wants to shape global standards?
Well, this is it. Yeah, I think the EU needs to fundamentally reassess, what the goals of its trade policy are. Because if the goal of its trade policy is to position Europe as a leader in global standards, then I think we have a major problem. But if the goal of our trade policy is to diversify our trading base, open up new opportunities for our companies, then I think Europe really can be a global leader. But it kind of requires a self-assessment, or also kind of a psychological self-assessment of how we view ourselves. If we try to force our trading partners to take on board our standards, then I think we will have a problem. And I would hope that the events of the last 12 months and what we've seen with trade deals agreed with India and Mercosur, I think we're entering into, I hope, a more pragmatic EU approach to trade.
All of this, of course, bring us back to Europe's budget and whether it can support all these priorities, right? Europe is juggling Ukraine's aid, the recovery fund, and higher defense spending. And now we have this new geopolitical shocks. Is the Commission current budget plan robust enough for this reality, and could financial pressure deepen divisions between the member states?
Absolutely. Look, the EU budget is always a divisive subject in Brussels, particularly among the member states. At the moment, the EU budget comes nowhere near meeting the needs of the geopolitical kind of objectives that the EU has set for itself. But we have to remember one thing about Europe. Sometimes, we hear this debate in Brussels a lot that Europe can't afford to do X or can't afford to do Y. But that's complete nonsense. We're the richest concentration of individual countries in the world. What we happen to have are a lot of very poor governments and very rich households. And I know sometimes my Italian friends don't like me to say this, but Italy is a very good example of that. Italy is a very rich government with a very rich households with very poor government. So it's how we allocate resources, who bears the risk. It's why Capital Markets Union and Savings Investment Union is so important, that we can allocate that money better and use that to fund our priorities in the years ahead.
Since you mentioned the household, middle-income households are squeezed by housing cost and economic insecurity. You've described this as a misallocation of wealth. If you had to prioritize one immediate structural reform to restore confidence among younger and middle-income voters, what would it be?
Well, I think there's one issue that's increasingly becoming dominant in every single EU member state, particularly for those voters under the age of 40, and that's the issue of housing. If we continue, trying to promote a housing model that was based on our grandparents' experience in the 50s and 60s, I think we're doomed to failure. In more and more countries, the single biggest determinant of social class for young people is the social position of their parents, and whether they will inherit or not inherit a house, an apartment, significant wealth. And you can see the divisions increasing in society. And it's actually only going to get worse because family sizes are getting smaller. So the gap between the haves and the have-nots will actually become wider and wider. So I think if I had the power, I would really encourage member states, because housing is, still a priority or a prerogative of the member states, not the EU institutions. But there are a whole range of incentives that could be brought in to try and equalise the opportunities in the housing market between the older generations and younger people today.
Thank you. And turning to Ireland, since Dublin will assume the Council presidency in July 2026, you suggested that Ireland may not be aligned with the EU's evolving strategic direction, particularly about defence. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between Ireland's political culture and today's EU power dynamics?
I think Ireland has become totally disassociated from EU debates on security and defence. Ireland has long taken refuge in its geographical status on the edge of Europe, but the reality is that Ireland is spending about 0.3, 0.4% of GDP on defence, and it has no significant naval or air abilities, not even to track ships or aeroplanes using its airspace or waters. So I think, I would hope that that issue will be raised by other EU states with Ireland during the presidency, because I believe that without external pressure, the situation won't change in Dublin.
As a last question, you've been particularly outspoken on Irish defence policy. You've argued that only a structured Anglo-Irish defence agreement can deliver credible territorial security. Is such a bilateral framework politically realistic, and how would it affect Ireland's standing within the EU?
Well, I think what you've seen actually interestingly in Dublin over the last months is a move to associate a lot more, not with the UK as I proposed, but actually with France. They've signed a bilateral agreement with France when it comes to a lot of military equipment that the Irish are looking to buy. So I think what you will see a lot more structured cooperation, not just with France, but also with other NATO members like the UK, because of all the important undersea infrastructure between that flows between the US and Europe that goes through Irish waters. At the moment, Ireland has no capability to protect, those assets, and I think that's where you will see a major kind of coming together of partnerships over the next few years.
Right. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us today. Thank you everyone for following us from home. If you like this episode of A View from Brussels, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. See you next time.